In January of 2002, a family of 6 left their farmhouse in rural Indiana for what should have been a short evening errand. It was the kind of trip that never makes it into memory. Familiar roads, familiar faces, nothing out of place. They were expected home before midnight. They never returned. There were no signs of a hurried departure. Their belongings stayed where they were. The house remained untouched, and no message was left behind to explain the silence. Still, nearly 3 months passed without a missing person report. How does an entire family disappear where silence is treated as normal? Before the Rowland family vanished, there was nothing about their life that suggested it would ever become a case file. Their days followed a pattern shaped by routine rather than choice, the kind of life that rarely attracts attention because it rarely breaks its own rules. Daniel Rowland had worked at Cedar Hollow Farm for many years. He was in his mid-50s, physically steady, emotionally reserved, and known for one thing above all else: reliability. He arrived when he was expected, finished what he started, and did not ask questions that might complicate his position. In rural Indiana, that kind of reputation carried quiet value. Daniel was not a man who drifted. He left tools where others could find them. He collected his wages on time. He did not disappear without explanation. Emily Rowland was much younger, still in her mid-20s, but responsibility had arrived early in her life. She managed the household with efficiency rather than sentiment, keeping track of meals, laundry, and 4 growing children in a place where the nearest store required planning. Those who knew her described her as practical, focused, and careful with what little they had. Life on the farm did not offer room for improvisation, and Emily understood that better than most. The children grew up inside that structure. Their days were simple, marked by chores, shared meals, and long stretches of open land that served as both playground and boundary. There were no after-school activities, no casual visits to friends' houses, no easy transportation into town. The farm provided everything they needed to live, and almost everything that kept them apart from the outside world. Cedar Hollow Farm sat miles from the nearest town, spread across more than 1,000 acres of fields, tree lines, and service roads that rarely saw unfamiliar traffic. The Rowlands lived in a small farmhouse provided by the owner, part of Daniel's employment arrangement. The house was modest but functional. It came with expectations as much as shelter. Work and home were inseparable, and privacy was limited by proximity and dependence. The family did not own a car. They did not have mobile phones. Communication with the outside world ran through a single landline located some distance from the house, shared with other farm operations. If someone needed to make a call, it required intention. If someone wanted to be unreachable, it required nothing at all. This dependence shaped every decision the Rowlands made. Groceries were purchased infrequently and carefully. Trips into town were planned around work schedules and availability of rides. Even small changes to routine required permission or coordination. Over time, this arrangement created a life that was quiet, predictable, and fragile. The owner of the farm, Thomas Edward Green, controlled more than land. He controlled access. Housing, employment, transportation, and information all passed through him in some form. Locally, he was seen as reserved and private, a man who preferred order and expected loyalty. To the Rowlands, he was not simply an employer. He was the point through which their stability flowed. That power imbalance was not dramatic. It did not announce itself with raised voices or visible conflict. It existed in smaller ways, in decisions deferred, in questions left unasked, in assumptions made about what could and could not be changed. For families like the Rowlands, stability often depended on staying unnoticed. From the outside, their life appeared calm. Neighbors, when asked later, struggled to recall specific moments because there had been nothing unusual to remember. The family kept to themselves. They were polite when encountered, brief in conversation, and consistent in behavior. Familiarity bred invisibility. What made the Rowlands particularly vulnerable was not hardship alone, but isolation combined with trust in routine. Their absence would not immediately trigger concern, because absence was already part of daily life. Days could pass without anyone stopping by. Weeks could go by without a phone call. Silence in that environment was not alarming. It was expected. This was not neglect. It was structure, a system built on self-sufficiency, distance, and unspoken boundaries. And for years, it functioned without incident. Nothing in the Rowlands' recent history suggested plans to leave. There were no known conflicts with neighbors, no talk of relocation, no preparations for a major change. Daniel's work record showed consistency. Emily maintained the household as usual. The children's routines remained unchanged. If the family had intended to leave, there would have been signs. In lives so constrained, movement leaves traces. But before the silence began, there was only continuity. Looking back, investigators would later note that the very features that made the Rowlands dependable workers and quiet neighbors also made them easy to overlook. Their life did not raise questions, and because no one was watching closely, no one noticed when that life stopped. The final confirmed sighting of the Rowland family did not occur in a place marked by urgency or conflict. It happened in a setting so ordinary that at the time, no one felt the need to remember it closely. On the evening of January 12th, 2002, the family traveled from Cedar Hollow Farm to a nearby town for a small gathering. It was not unusual for farm families to attend community events when circumstances allowed, and nothing about the trip suggested it would become significant. The distance was manageable, the roads familiar, and the purpose clear enough to require no explanation. Those who saw them that night later described the same details, repeated with quiet consistency. Daniel appeared calm, as he usually did. Emily stayed close to the children, attentive but unhurried. The kids behaved as expected, tired, slightly restless, but comfortable in a setting they had seen before. There were no raised voices, no visible tension, no signs of a family on the verge of disruption. If anything stood out, it was how unremarkable the moment felt. The Rowlands stayed for a reasonable length of time. They spoke briefly with others, offered polite goodbyes, and left together. No one recalled them arguing. No one remembered them leaving abruptly. There was no reason to watch them closely as they walked out into the night, because nothing about their departure felt final. They were expected back at the farmhouse before midnight. What happened after that point has never been directly observed. The next morning, Cedar Hollow Farm looked as it usually did. The fields were quiet. Equipment sat where it had been left. The farmhouse showed no signs of disturbance from the outside. There were no broken windows, no doors left open, no obvious indication that anything had gone wrong overnight. Inside the house, later descriptions would note the same absence of disruption. Clothing remained in place, personal items were undisturbed. The children's belongings were where they had been the day before. There were no packed bags, no missing essentials, no attempt to prepare for extended travel. For a family whose life required planning, even for short trips, this detail mattered. If the Rowlands had intended to leave permanently, the preparation would have been visible. They did not have the means to disappear casually. Every movement outside the farm required coordination. Every absence left a trace. Yet nothing in the house suggested intention, urgency, or foresight. One detail in particular would later trouble those trying to make sense of the timeline. Emily Rowland never returned to collect her wages. In a household where income was measured carefully and spending was deliberate, leaving money behind did not align with habit or necessity. It was not the kind of oversight the family could afford. At the time, however, no one stood in the farmhouse cataloging these inconsistencies. No officer walked through the rooms with questions in mind. No neighbor paused to consider why the house felt unchanged. The absence did not announce itself loudly enough to interrupt routine. Days passed, then weeks. The landline near the farmhouse remained silent. No calls were made. No messages were left. For families living closer to town, this might have raised immediate concern. For the Rowlands, whose contact with the outside world was already limited, silence blended easily into expectation. The farm continued operating. Work schedules adjusted naturally, as they often did. In rural settings, absence can be explained away temporarily without confrontation. People assume illness, a visit, a delay. The system is built to accommodate gaps without immediate inquiry. And so the Rowlands' absence settled into the landscape without resistance. What makes this period difficult to reconstruct is not a lack of data, but a lack of urgency. There was no single moment when concern crystallized. No dramatic discovery forced attention. Instead, the disappearance unfolded as a gradual realization, stretched thin across time. Those who would later speak about the case often returned to this point, not because something obvious had been missed, but because nothing obvious had happened. The last evening did not offer clues in the traditional sense. It offered normalcy. From an investigative perspective, this absence of disturbance created its own problem. Without signs of struggle or preparation, the situation resisted easy classification. Voluntary departure did not fit, but neither did an immediately visible alternative. The lack of visible evidence delayed recognition that something was wrong. In retrospect, the most striking feature of the Rowlands' final night is not what occurred, but what did not. There was no conflict recorded, no disagreement remembered, no sudden change in behavior. The family left together and was never seen again. That quiet ending would later shape every question that followed, because when a disappearance begins without noise, it often takes far too long before anyone realizes it has begun at all. The absence of the Rowland family did not immediately become a problem to be solved. It became a pause, long enough to feel intentional, short enough to be excused, and quiet enough to avoid confrontation. In the weeks after the family failed to return, no formal concern was raised. This was not because people were indifferent, but because rural life often operates on assumptions rather than confirmations. Families come and go, Schedules change. Silence in itself is rarely treated as evidence. What filled that silence was an explanation that arrived early and stayed unchallenged for far too long. The first person to offer an account of the Rowlands' absence was not a relative, a neighbor, or a local authority. It was Thomas Edward Green, the owner of Cedar Hollow Farm. When contacted by extended family members who were trying to understand why they had not heard from Daniel or Emily, Green explained that the family had taken an extended leave. According to him, the Rowlands were on a break, a long one. On the surface, the explanation sounded plausible enough to delay action. Green was the employer. He controlled work schedules, housing arrangements, and access to the property. If anyone would know where the family had gone, it would be him. In communities built on hierarchy and trust, such statements are rarely questioned immediately, but the explanation carried inconsistencies that only became obvious later. Daniel Rowland had never taken a prolonged absence from work. His employment history showed brief, predictable breaks, never extending beyond a couple of weeks. The family's financial situation did not allow for extended, unplanned time away. And yet, the idea of a months-long leave was accepted without documentation, without verification, and without urgency. This acceptance created a dangerous illusion that nothing required immediate attention. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the explanation hardened into assumption. The Rowlands were away. They would return. There was no need to involve law enforcement, no need to escalate concern. The farm continued operating, adapting quietly as it always had. For relatives living outside the immediate area, distance complicated doubt. Phone calls were infrequent, even before the disappearance. The family did not maintain regular correspondence. Silence, while uncomfortable, did not immediately signal alarm. Green's explanation filled the informational gap, offering reassurance where uncertainty might otherwise have grown. From a procedural standpoint, this period represents the most critical failure in the entire case. 3 months passed before a formal missing person report was filed. During that time, no official record acknowledged the Rowlands' absence. No property was secured, no timeline was established, no interviews were conducted with urgency. The farmhouse remained accessible. The surrounding land remained untouched. Whatever evidence might once have existed was left to time, weather, and routine use. This delay was not accidental. It was structural. In rural employment arrangements, like the Rowlands, authority often substitutes for oversight. Employers act as intermediaries between workers and institutions. When that authority provides an explanation, it tends to settle questions rather than raise them. Green's position allowed his account to function as a temporary truth, even without proof. The delay also reveals how vulnerability operates quietly. The Rowlands were not absent from a city apartment with neighbors on all sides. They lived on land owned by someone else, worked under someone else's control, and communicated through channels that required access. When they disappeared, the system that should have protected them deferred instead. By the time concern finally crystallized into action, it did so from outside the immediate environment. It was Emily Rowland's mother, Margaret Collins, who ultimately filed the report. The delay had unsettled her. Phone calls went unanswered longer than usual. Green's explanation felt increasingly strained. A mother's instinct, sharpened by time rather, then calmed by reassurance, pushed her to act. When the report was filed, nearly 3 months had already passed. From an investigative perspective, those months cannot be recovered. They represent lost context, altered scenes, and faded memory. Witness recollections weaken, physical environments change, the natural rhythm of the farm continues, erasing subtle markers that might have mattered. But beyond evidence, something else was lost during that time. Momentum. Urgency gives shape to questions. Without it, some inquiries lose force. By accepting an explanation without scrutiny, the system allowed the Rowlands' disappearance to age before it was ever examined. The case entered official channels already burdened by delay, assumption, and uncertainty. What makes this gap particularly troubling is not that no one cared, but that the structure of authority made care unnecessary. Green's word carried enough weight to postpone doubt. And as long as doubt remained postponed, action remained optional. When authorities were finally notified, they inherited a situation already compromised by time and trust. The disappearance had not unfolded suddenly. It had been absorbed slowly, normalized through repetition, and buffered by explanation. In retrospect, the 3-month gap stands as the moment when the case shifted from preventable to precarious. Not because something specific happened during those months, but because nothing did. And in that absence of action, silence became the most powerful force shaping what came next. When the disappearance of the Rowland family finally entered the formal system, it did not do so with urgency. It arrived quietly, stripped of momentum, already shaped by assumptions that had hardened during the months of inaction. The case was not treated as an emergency. It was classified as a routine inquiry into whereabouts, a category that carries an unspoken premise that the missing individuals are likely alive, mobile, and responsible for their own absence. This classification mattered more than it appeared. It determined how resources were allocated, how questions were framed, and which possibilities were considered worth pursuing. From the beginning, authorities leaned toward the idea that the Rowlands had chosen to leave. The theory required fewer questions, fewer disruptions, and less confrontation with local power structures. It fit neatly into the narrative that had already circulated for months, that the family had simply gone elsewhere, perhaps seeking work or distance. This assumption shaped the tone of the early response. There was no immediate sealing of the farmhouse, no comprehensive documentation of its contents, no urgent effort to reconstruct the family's final movements. Instead, investigators relied heavily on statements already provided, particularly those from Thomas Edward Green. Green was cooperative in appearance. He answered questions calmly, reiterated his account of the family's supposed leave, and allowed limited access to parts of the property. His demeanor reinforced the perception that nothing adversarial existed beneath the surface. In environments where familiarity often substitutes for verification, this cooperation carried weight. But cooperation is not the same as scrutiny. The first official search of Cedar Hollow Farm occurred months after the disappearance. By then, the land had continued to function as it always had. Equipment had been moved, paths had been driven, weather had passed through fields and structures. The farmhouse itself had not been preserved as a static space, but treated as an ordinary vacant dwelling. Investigators walking through the house encountered a place that felt lived in, not abandoned. That detail, paradoxically, worked against urgency. There was no visible chaos to provoke alarm. The absence of disorder was interpreted as evidence of intentional departure rather than a reason to question deeper. In rural investigations, context is often as important as evidence, but context can be misread when those interpreting it are unfamiliar with the vulnerabilities of isolated families. The Rowlands' lack of preparation for departure was noted, but not prioritized. The absence of missing items was acknowledged, but not framed as contradiction. Each inconsistency was observed in isolation rather than assembled into a larger question. At the same time, the investigation remained structurally constrained. With the case classified narrowly, authorities lacked both the mandate and the motivation to pursue invasive measures. No broad warrants were issued. No intensive forensic sweeps were conducted. The land remained open, not only to routine activity, but to gradual erasure. What further complicated the situation was the dynamic between local law enforcement and Green himself. Cedar Hollow Farm was not just a work site. It was a long-standing fixture in the community. Green's family had owned the land for years. His presence was familiar, his authority largely unquestioned. This familiarity shaped interactions in subtle ways. Interviews were conversational rather than interrogative. Visits to the property were framed as cooperative exchanges, not investigative incursions. Boundaries blurred, not through overt misconduct, but through comfort. For relatives of the Rowlands, this dynamic was immediately troubling. They attempted to push for deeper inquiry, but encountered procedural resistance. Access to the case file was delayed. Requests for broader searches were met with caution. Legal standing for family representation took time to establish. Each step forward required navigation through layers of interpretation and restraint. Time, once again, worked against them. As weeks turned into months and months into years, the investigation accumulated distance from the original event. Witnesses struggled to recall specifics. Small details faded or shifted. What had once been unusual became normalized through repetition. The absence of resolution began to feel permanent. Perhaps most damaging was the loss of narrative control. By treating the disappearances voluntary, authorities implicitly signaled to the community that there was nothing to fear and nothing to pursue. This discouraged unsolicited testimony. People who might have noticed something unusual were not prompted to re-examine their memories. Silence settled not because no one knew anything, but because no one was asked in a way that demanded response. At one point, a specialized investigative unit was quietly assembled. Unlike earlier efforts, this team approached the case with renewed attention, revisiting timelines and re-interviewing local residents. According to later accounts, their work began to surface inconsistencies that had previously been overlooked. Then, just as quietly, the unit was removed from the case. No formal explanation was offered. No results were published. Responsibility shifted back to local authorities, and the momentum evaporated. For the Rowlands' relatives, this moment confirmed what they had long suspected, that progress was possible, but not permitted to continue. From an investigative standpoint, this interruption was more than administrative. It represented a break in continuity, a loss of institutional memory, and a signal that certain lines of inquiry were unwelcome. Cases do not collapse from a single failure. They erode through repeated interruptions that prevent accumulation of insight. Meanwhile, the farmhouse remained unsealed, the land remained active. Any subtle traces that might once have existed were now irretrievable, not because they had been destroyed deliberately, but because they had been left unprotected. What distinguishes this phase of the case is not negligence in the dramatic sense. There were no shouting matches, no overt refusals to act. Instead, there was a steady pattern of deferral. Each decision, taken alone, appeared reasonable. Together, they formed a system that allowed a disappearance of 6 people to be absorbed without consequence. Investigations rely on friction. They advance by challenging assumptions, testing explanations, and unsettling comfortable narratives. In the Rowland case, friction was avoided, explanations were accepted, authority was trusted, silence was interpreted as confirmation rather than warning. By the time years had passed, the case had lost its immediacy. It existed as a file, revisited occasionally, discussed quietly, but no longer driven by urgency. For the family, this period marked a shift from waiting for answers to fighting for attention. The investigation had not failed in a single moment. It had failed by never fully beginning. As the official investigation lost momentum, something else moved in to fill the space it left behind. It did not arrive with authority or structure. It spread quietly, through conversation rather than records, through suggestion rather than proof. Rumor became the dominant force, shaping how the disappearance of the Rowland family was understood. In small communities, silence rarely remains empty for long. At first, the speculation seemed harmless. People tried to make sense of the absence using familiar explanations. Perhaps the family had left the state for work. Perhaps they were staying with relatives and had chosen not to be contacted. These theories were not malicious. They were attempts to restore order to a situation that resisted explanation. But speculation has a way of drifting once it is no longer anchored to fact. One story, in particular, gained traction. A local man claimed he had seen the Rowlands traveling out of state, heading toward a distant destination known for seasonal gatherings. The details were vague, but confident enough to sound convincing. He described a family on the move, children in tow, seemingly intentional and unafraid. For investigators already inclined toward the idea of voluntary departure, the account offered validation. Time and resources were redirected. Leads were pursued beyond county lines. Attention shifted away from Cedar Hollow Farm, away from the place where the family had last been seen with certainty. In hindsight, the problem was not that the lead existed, but that it was accepted too quickly. The account did not align cleanly with the established timeline. It conflicted with known limitations on the family's mobility. It offered no explanation for abandoned wages, untouched belongings, or prolonged silence. Yet for a time, it dominated the conversation around the case. Years later, the man would be charged with providing false information. By then, the damage had already been done. Critical early months had been spent chasing a narrative that felt easier than confronting the one that remained unspoken. While authorities followed distant possibilities, the local environment grew increasingly quiet. Neighbors who might have noticed changes on the farm hesitated to speak. Workers who passed through the property avoided speculation. The community did not erupt into fear or outrage. Instead, it closed ranks around familiarity. In places where relationships overlap across work, land, and history, suspicion carries consequences. Fear does not always announce itself openly. Sometimes it appears as restraint. People weighed what they might say against what it could cost them: employment, housing, access, reputation. These were not abstract concerns, they were daily realities. The disappearance of one family was troubling. Becoming the next person to attract attention felt worse. As rumors multiplied, they began to contradict each other. Some painted the Rowlands as restless, others suggested internal conflict. A few hinted at darker possibilities without naming them. None were supported by evidence. All distracted from the same unresolved fact. 6 people had vanished from a known location without explanation. This fragmentation of narrative had a subtle but lasting effect. It eroded focus. When a case becomes crowded with competing stories, each one slightly plausible, urgency dissolves. No single theory commands enough confidence to demand decisive action. Instead, attention shifts between possibilities, none of which are tested deeply enough to be confirmed or dismissed. For the Rowlands' relatives, this phase was particularly painful. They were forced to navigate not only the absence of answers, but the presence of speculation. Every rumor required response. Every false lead raised hopes, only to let them fall again. The search for truth became entangled with the task of correcting misinformation. At the same time, the tone of the case shifted in public perception. It was no longer treated as an unresolved emergency, but as a puzzle with too many pieces. Interest faded. The story lost clarity. People stopped asking direct questions. From an investigative standpoint, this diffusion was damaging. Effective inquiry depends on narrowing focus, not expanding it endlessly. Each unverified theory that gained attention pulled resources away from foundational questions. What was the last confirmed location? Who had control over that environment? What assumptions were being made without evidence? Instead of returning to these basics, the case drifted. Witnesses who might have come forward early were now less certain of what they had seen or heard. Memory is not static. It reshapes itself around dominant narratives. Over time, people recall events not as they occurred, but as they believe they should have occurred based on what they have since heard. This made later testimony more fragile. Some locals later admitted that they had noticed unusual absences or changes on the farm during the early weeks. A vehicle not seen again, areas avoided, schedules altered. At the time, these observations felt minor. Later, when rumors had already set the tone, they felt irrelevant or risky to mention. The longer silence persisted, the more difficult it became to break. Rumors also had another effect. They allowed responsibility to disperse. If the family left voluntarily, then no one was accountable. If they were seen elsewhere, then the disappearance was someone else's problem. Each speculative path offered relief from the uncomfortable idea that something might have happened close to home. This psychological distancing is common in unresolved cases, particularly those involving vulnerable families. It allows communities to preserve a sense of normalcy by relocating threat elsewhere. For the Rowlands, however, normalcy had already been lost. As years passed, the wrong roads hardened into accepted history. New investigators inherited a file cluttered with unverified claims, half-pursued leads, and conclusions reached without closure. Sorting signal from noise became increasingly difficult. Yet within this confusion, one pattern remained consistent. The farther speculation traveled, The quieter Cedar Hollow farm became in the narrative, the place where the family had lived, worked, and last been seen slowly receded from focus. Attention moved outward, chasing movement rather than questioning stillness. This inversion mattered. Disappearances are often solved by returning to the point of certainty, not by expanding the map indefinitely. In the Roland case, that return was delayed by years of misdirection, not always deliberate, but deeply consequential. By the time some in the community began to reconsider what they had accepted, the case had aged beyond urgency. Evidence was no longer fresh. Memory was no longer reliable. Fear had already done its work. What remained was a landscape shaped more by rumor than record. And in that landscape, truth did not disappear. It simply learned how to hide behind stories that sounded easier to believe. For more than a decade, the disappearance of the Roland family remained suspended in the same uneasy state. The file existed, the questions remained, but nothing moved forward in a meaningful way. The case had become something people referenced carefully, if at all, as though speaking about it too directly might disturb a balance no one fully understood. That balance shifted in 2016. Thomas Edward Green, the owner of Cedar Hollow Farm, died quietly without public attention. His passing did not immediately alter the status of the case in any official sense. No announcements were made, no new warrants were issued. On paper, nothing had changed, but in the community, something had. Green's presence had shaped the environment around the farm for years, not through constant visibility, but through permanence. He was someone whose authority was assumed, whose reactions were anticipated, whose reach was understood even when unspoken. With his death, that constant pressure eased not abruptly, but perceptibly. It was after this moment that new voices began to surface. At first, they came hesitantly. A former worker mentioned something in passing. A neighbor recalled a detail they had previously dismissed. These were not dramatic revelations. They were fragments, observations that had once felt too small or too risky to mention. What changed was not the content of the memories, but the willingness to share them. One testimony, in particular, drew renewed attention to the case. A witness stated that in the days following the Rowlands' last confirmed sighting, Daniel Rowland had been seen performing unusual labor on the property. According to this account, Daniel had been instructed to dig pits in an area of the land not typically used for routine farm work. The timing of this detail mattered. The activity reportedly occurred after the family attended the evening gathering, but before their absence was formally acknowledged. The task itself was described as out of pattern, not part of Daniel's usual responsibilities. At the time, it raised no immediate alarm. Farm work often involves digging. Questions are rarely asked when instructions come from above. Years later, however, the memory carried different weight. Investigators treated the statement cautiously. Memory degrades over time, and delayed testimony requires careful evaluation. Still, the account aligned with something the case had long lacked, a reason to refocus attention on Cedar Hollow Farm itself rather than on distant possibilities. With this renewed focus came a shift in investigative posture. Authorities authorized new searches of the property, targeting areas that had not been examined during earlier efforts. These searches were conducted with modern tools and forensic guidance, but they faced an unavoidable limitation. Time had already altered the landscape. Vegetation had grown, soil had shifted. Normal farm operations had continued uninterrupted for years. The goal was no longer to recover what might once have been obvious, but to detect what might still be traceable beneath layers of change. Specialized forensic teams were brought in to assist. Their role was not to draw conclusions, but to apply methodical techniques suited to long-term cases. Ground analysis, targeted excavation, and environmental assessment replaced the broader, less focused searches of earlier years. At the same time, investigators began preparing for discoveries that might never come. DNA profiles were collected from surviving relatives of the Rowland family. These samples were cataloged and stored, not in expectation of immediate results, but as groundwork. The logic was forward-looking. If remains were ever found, on this land or elsewhere, identification would not be delayed by absence of reference. For the family, this step carried a complicated meaning. Providing DNA was an act of hope, but also an acknowledgement of what that hope implied. It did not answer questions. It prepared for answers that might arrive in an unfamiliar form. Throughout this renewed phase, officials remained careful in their language. No accusations were made, no conclusions announced. The emphasis was on process rather than outcome. The case, they said, was active again. For relatives who had spent years pushing against inertia, this distinction mattered less than the fact of movement. For the first time in a long while, the disappearance was being treated as something unresolved rather than something assumed. Community response was mixed. Some residents welcomed the renewed attention, expressing regret that earlier opportunities had been missed. Others remained wary. Even without Green's presence, the habits formed under years of silence did not dissolve overnight. Speaking openly still felt risky, even if the source of fear was no longer there. This hesitation revealed an important truth about cases like this one. Fear does not always end when its origin disappears. It lingers in routines, in caution, in the memory of consequences once observed or imagined. From an investigative standpoint, the renewed testimony and forensic efforts did not provide immediate clarity. Searches did not yield definitive evidence. No discovery forced resolution. What they did provide was direction. The focus returned to first principles: location, access, authority, timing. Rather than chasing movement, investigators began questioning stillness. Instead of asking where the family might have gone, they asked who had the power to explain their absence without challenge. The framework of the case shifted subtly but decisively. What made this phase different from earlier attempts was not the technology alone, but the willingness to reconsider assumptions that had gone unchallenged for years. Voluntary departure, once treated as a default explanation, began to lose its hold. This did not transform suspicion into certainty. It transformed complacency into inquiry. For the Rowlands' relatives, this period was marked by cautious optimism. They had learned through experience to temper expectation. Progress had come before, only to stall again. Still, the fact that new questions were being asked and old answers re-examined suggested that the case had not been abandoned to history. The disappearance remained unresolved, but it was no longer static. What emerged after Green's death was not truth in its final form, but possibility. The possibility that silence had protected more than it revealed. The possibility that what had once been unspeakable could now be examined without fear. In long unsolved cases, resolution rarely arrives as a single moment. More often, it begins with a shift in atmosphere, a loosening of restraint, a willingness to look again at what had been accepted too easily. For the Rowland family, that shift came late, but it came. By the time the investigation into the disappearance of the Rowland family entered its third decade, it no longer resembled the case it once was. The urgency of the early days had long since faded, replaced by persistence rather than expectation. What remained was not a race against time, but a refusal to let time decide the outcome. In the years following the renewed focus on Cedar Hollow Farm, authorities adjusted their strategy. The case was no longer approached as an open-ended mystery scattered across distant locations. Instead, it narrowed deliberately and carefully toward what investigators now described as the last point of certainty, where the family had lived, where they had worked, where their lives had been contained. This shift mattered. Rather than expanding the map, the investigation turned inward. New legal counsel representing the Rowlands' relatives pushed for clarity of purpose, arguing that earlier efforts had failed not because of lack of information, but because of lack of focus. The aim was no longer to prove every possibility wrong, but to examine one place thoroughly enough that it could no longer be ignored. Technology became part of that effort. Advances unavailable in the early 2000s were now considered essential tools. Remote imaging, its environmental analysis, and long-term land assessment offered ways to read landscapes altered by time. Investigators acknowledged the limits of traditional searches on property that had remained active for years. The solution, they believed, lay above and beneath the surface. Requests were made for satellite imagery spanning multiple decades, not to produce certainty, but to identify anomalies, subtle changes in soil, vegetation, or land use that might warrant closer inspection. It was an approach rooted in patience and, rather than spectacle, designed to support methodical inquiry rather than dramatic discovery. Alongside technology came renewed efforts to reach people who had remained silent. Financial incentives were increased, not as a reward for rumor, but as an acknowledgement of risk. Authorities recognized that silence had not been maintained by indifference alone. Fear, habit, and dependence had all played their roles. Breaking that silence required more than appeals to conscience. It required protection, reassurance, and time. For the Rowlands family, this phase represented a complicated kind of progress. Emily's mother, now older and wearier than when she first filed the report, continued to cooperate with investigators. Her role had never been that of a crusader. She did not seek attention or recognition. She sought an answer, even if that answer arrived in a form she had once hoped to avoid. Siblings provided DNA, knowing it might never be matched. They spoke publicly only when necessary, careful not to assign blame or speculate beyond what could be supported. Their persistence was quiet, shaped by years of disappointment, but no less resolute. What sustained them was not certainty, but continuity. The case remained open, files were updated, searches, though limited, continued. Each action reaffirmed a simple truth: unresolved did not mean forgotten. In the community surrounding Cedar Hollow Farm, attitudes shifted gradually. Younger residents, less bound by past hierarchies, asked questions more freely. Older residents, once cautious, began to reconsider what silence had cost them. Memory, though imperfect, regained relevance. There was no single moment of reckoning, no announcement that changed everything. Instead, the case evolved into something quieter but more durable, a long-term commitment to accountability. From an investigative standpoint, the Rowland case stands as an example of how disappearances endure not only because of what happens, but because of what fails to happen afterward. Delay, assumption, and misplaced trust can obscure truth just as effectively as deception. Yet it also illustrates something else, that persistence, even when late, still matters. The absence of answers does not erase responsibility. It does not invalidate questions, and it does not diminish the value of continuing to look, even when the path forward is uncertain. Today, the disappearance of the Rowland family remains unresolved, but it is no longer silent. And as long as that question remains open, the search does too. If this story stayed with you, let us know where you are listening from and what question it left in your mind. If you value careful storytelling like this, consider subscribing to the channel so these stories are not forgotten.